Welcome to LeaderWARE at Flow. In a moment, Mike R.J. will present Part 1 of the introduction to our 2015 Adult Development Program. In Part 1, Mike will be discussing the content, which we'll find at leadu.info/leaderware/intro. He then goes into greater detail in Part 2. You'll also be given access to the slides Mike uses in Part 2. To gain the greatest benefit from our LeaderWARE at Flow Adult Development Program, you may want to consider joining Mike's Inner Circle membership at Flow. You may learn more by visiting livingatflow.com/inner circle. If you have any comments or questions for Mike, you may send them to support@leadu.info. And now, here's Mike.
Hello, this is Mike J, and welcome to LeaderWARE at Flow. This is an introduction that I am doing for those who are perhaps interested in the program. What I've done is I've laid out this particular synopsis in a way that we can follow along with me, so to speak. We basically are starting with a background of developmental coaching. In other words, I'm going to tell you in just a moment the idea behind the whole process of using LeaderWARE in what we call VUCA conditions. Those are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous conditions. The idea here is that we're going to use this process as part of an overall process, which I'll show you the reason for now. Look at this particular chart right here. This is probably about 2 decades old, but in my experience with coaching around the world, I have seen this Metamodel hold up in regards to what you're going to spend or invest and what kind of results you're going to get. Where we're working right now is right here. If you look at this particular piece right here, you're going to see that customized individual developmental portfolios, which is what we're going to show you how to create in the process of LeaderWARE using 7 dynamics, gives us the greatest amount of bang for the buck. So regardless of if you're using canned training programs like we're creating here, or you're using an in-house program that's been customized, or you're integrating the initiative itself by adding coaching and measurement of coaching, or you put that together with an organizational intervention, the biggest bang for your buck is going to come in this area right here. And this is something that I have seen proven out over time, regardless of whether it's attached to coaching or mentoring or organizational improvements or seminars or whatever it is. Having an individualized developmental portfolio is key. Let me just show you why. If you look here, there is a formula that I have created that self-knowledge is equal to or promotes self-awareness, which promotes a broader form of awareness called that we're calling leader awareness. So our focus is how do we create leader awareness? If you look at this particular chart right here, this chart has to do with emotional intelligence and the work that has been done over the past, say 3 decades, since the late 80s, in terms of how do we create positive impacts on others. Now we know from psychology that recognition and regulation, in other words, recognition of what's going on, and then regulating not only ourselves but others to the process, is the key underlying structure that's occurring in the process of emotional intelligence. If you look here, the linchpin is self-awareness. Well, what I found a long time ago is that self-awareness is more than likely born in. In other words, the range of self-awareness that anyone is going to achieve over their lifetime is more than likely hardwired. Now, that doesn't mean that we all develop all we have, and that's the point of this program. In other words, what I've done is I've taken the emphasis off of self-awareness, even though it's a linchpin, and put that back into self-knowledge. Well, how can we help people begin to understand about themselves and begin to create these customized individual development portfolios, and why do we need to do it? Well, this is in part what I'm going to show you in the introductory PowerPoint in just a few minutes, but let me just show you one more problem that's occurring that we're going to address. Here's the people, okay, this line here is the people and their development over time as measured by this process called lectical levels, all right, Theo Dawson's word. And this is the jobs themselves. In other words, over time, as management begins to become more complex, the level at which you have to meet that complexity is increasing. Okay, I think everyone would agree with that. That's a pretty standard way, even though this comes from primary research, this graph, and what Theo has found in terms of measuring people over long periods of time that claim to be in these management levels. What we start to see is that in general, when you reach this particular level here, which is what Piaget and others who have done research beyond that call post-formal development, that you begin to see a curve or the slope of this adaptation to the complexity of the job drop way off. And you can see that there's a bit of an uptick as we go through the management levels. In other words, oftentimes we have a tendency to recruit more capability to the higher levels than we do in the mid levels, because we're sorting the mid levels out for this capability that we can put in the higher levels. And since there are such fewer numbers of jobs here, we have larger numbers here that are being sorted for these jobs. So we get an uptick in the closing of the gap here for a while. And then once we get to the very complex work that we have going on in multinationals and higher forms of governance and those kinds of things like that, we again begin to plateau like you saw here. And the gap begins to, of course, widen dramatically because the number of individuals that are actually suitable for this particular area or have the self-awareness potential to develop are beginning to become rare at this point. So what's happening is as we struggle through what is basically an entry management area where we're okay, and then the job becomes much more complex, we actually have this huge gap that's formed where people are less complex than the actual job demands. This is why when you couple this with this particular type of program, you get so much bang for the buck, because the potential of self-awareness that people do have is then brought forward in the self-knowledge process, which then goes on to take advantage of whatever self-awareness is there and create this broader form of leader awareness, which then begins to help us create positive impact on others. So part of this process, I want to show one more diagram here before we actually get into the introduction. Part of this process has to do with experiential learning and growth. In other words, the idea that we can acquire skills over time, but we acquire the skills unevenly over time. In other words, in terms of our behavior, the way we create affect in other people and ourselves, the ways in which we perceive that, and the way that we create artifacts or symbols that go along with this is a spiraling process, but it's often very uneven, and it has a tendency, which I've tried to draw here, in favoring the individual bias that each of us have. In other words, some of us are much more behavioral complex than we will be symbolic or affective or perceptual. So we have a tendency to become asymmetrical individuals. Well, this is important to understand, because what I believe is that we can, through this process, and here's just a network diagram of these 7 dynamics. What I felt is that when we look at this process of you, me, and we, which is kind of a shorthand for us and everything that's out there, we begin to pick up dynamics. And over 3 decades of coaching, I've focused on these 7 plus this really important metacognitive element that we're finding actually begins to dramatically influence the skill acquisition when you embed metacognition into the study of these different dynamics. And of course, this program will cover these dynamics. And what we're doing here is they're all linked together. So we end up with what is basically a symmetrical problem at times with asymmetrical approaches. And what I have decided over a long period of coaching people around the world, that it's better to scaffold people and their limitations and allow them to continue to work in strengths rather than it is to spend significant amounts of time having them work on the weaknesses. And so when we go back and we look at this reason for having a customized individual developmental portfolio, we're doing that in concert with their talent, in concert with their limitations. And rather than spending significant amounts of time on trying to lift up their limitations, we're using a surround or a resource environment to actually scaffold those up and allowing the person to spend the majority of their time in the areas where they're already really good. And of course, we know that's where skill acquisition actually becomes highest, in areas where we already have skill. So this process that I put together after 3 decades of coaching and after a lot of successful failures is basically encapsulated in this particular program. So I've shown another graphic here. Again, I think graphics help us because they sort of help us put the puzzle together in terms of what we have to begin to look at in terms of creating a developmental portfolio. In other words, the key here, and I believe the linchpin, remember, let me just take you back right quick. Research has shown, and I probably should add that slide for the future, is that without this, you get very little of this. Without self-awareness, you do not get much social awareness unless it's already wired in. Without self-awareness, you do not get very much self-management. So any program that enhances whatever ability we have wired in for us to be self-aware is going to be very helpful. Well, what do we need to be able to help that wired in process with? And that, of course, is these dynamics that I've basically filtered out and distilled over a long period of time working with people around the world. We need to understand our capability, and we'll tell you what that is in the program. We need to understand bias. We need to understand at what level are we able to operate with all these different things. We need to understand what values are important, what means and ends values are. We need to look at the system itself. Remember, Deming said 95% of the time it's the system. And then, of course, the role and how that fits with our style are all important. So when you begin to weave all these things with all their interconnections, it becomes a little bit complex. What I've done is I've tried to create this process as a way of helping others create a portfolio in kind of a step-by-step process. In other words, working through the process one step at a time rather than just taking a bite out of that whole complex network model. So part of what I want to show in the next segment is the slides that go along with the introduction and why in this VUCA world that we have and these growing gaps that we're producing, it's going to be important that we begin to model the solution for emerging adaptive responses because we just don't really have the complete answers. We're going to need to work on those over a period of time. So stay with me in the next segment, and I'm going to talk to you about these introductory slides. And those of you that have that particular page can look at this on your own. And of course, I put together a VUCA slide deck out of slide sharing, which is a kind of a commons for slides that I think explains what kind of conditions we have right now. And then what I also added for you was this executive summary that was done by Rick Petrie in his Harvard work a couple of years ago for Center for Creative Leadership, and looking around at are there leadership programs available to be doing what we're talking about doing. And then, of course, this LeaderWARE Dynamics is sort of a white paper. Or white paper-ish. It doesn't have the references yet that you're going to need, but it leads you in writing through this process that I basically kind of explained in figurative terms. So please come back, join me for the rest of the piece, and we'll show you how to get involved with LeaderWARE and the program to coach, teach, mentor, and train other people in this particular program.